everybody, my name is Mars, you can call me MG if you would like, and today I have what I think is going to be an exciting video. So basically, over the course of this past year, I have reread the Ranger's Apprentice series by John Flanagan. It's one of my favorite series ever. I started reading it in middle school, so like over a decade ago, and it's been such a special series to me. It's got such a big place in my heart. And so what I did was, starting in January, I read one book every month, and there's 10 books, so that took me to October. Then I took November off, and then this month, December, I read the short story collection that follows the series and like kind of concludes it all. So we are just going to go down the line and talk about how I felt about each book, if my thoughts changed between like my first time reading it and now, which I've read these books like maybe a dozen times total. Like, I've reread these a lot. The earlier ones especially, I've reread so many times. Some of the later ones I've only read a couple of times, but like, we're just gonna talk about it and how I felt about it this time around. So the first book in the series is The Ruins of Gorlan, and I gave this a 10 out of 10. This was absolutely fantastic. I had a great time reading this. This was also the book club pick for the Nostalgia Train book club in March. So I read it in January, but I talked about it with some friends a couple of months later. It was a collab actually between the Nostalgia Train book club and the Tome Travelers book club. So there was a bunch of people involved talking about this book, and it was just so fun. I really like the character development in this book and how we see these characters start off one way and then things progress and set the stage for how the rest of the series is going to go. I especially love Will and Horace together in this because they end up becoming like the best of friends later on in the series, but they hate each other at the beginning. And I feel like that turn from not liking each other to being like wary allies into actually becoming friends, I like that arc so much. I think it's very well done. So this was actually my first read of the year. Like overall, it was the first book I picked up, and I could not have made a better choice. Then in February, I picked up book 2, which is The Burning Bridge, and this is my favorite book in the entire series. It's just an amazing book. We get to build off of the stuff that we got in book 1, which book 1 did have a lot of great character moments and everything, but it is the first book in a really long series, so a lot of it was just set up for things to come later, and this is the book where we really get into things, and Will is really pushed out of his comfort zone to go on and do great things, and we are introduced to some key players that show up later on in the series, like Evelyn and Eric. Overall, I just adore this book. I have no complaints about it. March's read was book 3, which is The Icebound Land, and I give this an 8 out of 10. I did really enjoy it and love it so much, but this book was kind of low in terms of plot. Like, it had an arc, but a lot of it was build up for the second book in this mini duology, because the way Ranger's Apprentice is set up is it's kind of a series of duologies. Like, they all follow one big plot of Will becoming a ranger's apprentice and eventually becoming a ranger himself, but the like stories are kind of partnered off, so like the first 2 books really flow well together, and then books 3 and 4 go together. It's just, this one isn't the greatest. It was still so great. I gave it an 8 out of 10, but it's definitely not the highest point in the series for me. Then we have book 4, which is The Battle for Scandia, and the action in this one is fantastic. It does pick up so much more from what we should have gotten in book 3 but didn't get, so that makes up for it, although I do think that the character development in this one falls a little flat, so I also give this one an 8 out of 10. It kind of balances out book 3. I wasn't a huge fan of the ending in this one. I feel like it's way too similar to the end of book 1 and doesn't really give us anything new to work with, but still an 8 out of 10. I really love this. When I like give my criticisms of these books, just know that it's nothing like major. It's still a great book. I'm just being very nitpicky about it because I've been reading these books over and over again for the past 10 years. Then for May, we actually skipped ahead to book 7, which is Eric's Ransom, because chronologically this takes place between books 4 and 5, and usually I just read it in publication order, but this time around I was like, you know what? Let's go chronological on this one. So this book was written because John Flanagan released book 4, where Will is still very much an apprentice, and then there was like a little bit of a time skip, and book 5, Will is no longer an apprentice. He's a ranger in full right of his own. And a lot of people were like, why was his graduation from being an apprentice not shown on the page? Like, that's whack. So he's like, you're right. And he wrote this book. I gave this one a 6 out of 10. This is easily my least favorite in the series. I really, really love the first bit, like the opening act, and I really, really love the ending, but the entire second act, so the middle, like 50% of the book, I cannot stand. I found myself skimming through it and like skipping pages. I'm like, oh, this is awful. So this follows Will as he goes to, but it's basically the fantasy version of the Middle East, and there's some like not really great representation. There's like desert nomadic traveling groups, as well as like non-nomadic civilizations in this book, and just the way these people are depicted isn't great. It's like not outright racist in its depictions like some books do with white people writing Middle Eastern inspired fantasy, but it's definitely not like great. It's just so weird the way they talk about some of the people and like the descriptions they give of the characters. It's just a little bit uncomfy. And just the struggles that Will goes through in this book, I just hate reading about. So, this book, I still gave it a 6 out of 10. It's a Ranger's Apprentice book. It's good. If you like the series, you're not going to absolutely hate this book. But for me, this is definitely the lowest point in the series. But then we picked things back up with book 5, which is The Sorcerer of the North, and this book, along with book 6, which make up, like I said, their own little duology within the larger series, they're just so fun. If you like wintry fantasy, this is probably the part of the series that you would like the best. We also get back into the magic of things a little bit. So this series is a high fantasy, but it's very low on the magic and the like mysticalness of fantasy. So in book 1, we get a lot of that with these like strange creatures called the Kalkara and a couple of other things going on, and then it kind of dies out and it's just like no magic whatsoever, but it's still a fantasy because it takes place in a world that's not our own, as similar as it is to our real world. But then in this section, books 5 and 6, we do get a little bit more of that magic and mysticalness, and it's a lot of fun. So I gave this one a 9 out of 10. I really enjoyed this book. And then with book 6, The Siege of Mackinac, I actually cried while reading this. I didn't expect it whatsoever, but like, there's just this moment in here that I don't want to spoil because this is book 6 in a series, and like, who spoils book 6 in a series? That's crazy. But it was just so emotional for me. I'm so sorry for the train horn in the background. I don't know what's going on, but like, I was in tears and it was wonderful. I gave this book a 10 out of 10. This is probably my second favorite in the series, directly after The Burning Bridge. Then in August, I picked up book 8, which is The Kings of Clonmel, and this actually, I mean, it still follows Will, but it has a lot to do with the past of his mentor, Halt. So Will starts off as an apprentice. He's apprenticed to Halt, who is a ranger, but Halt isn't actually from the main country in this world. So the main country is Araluen, and it's very much a like England, US kind of inspired world. And then like other countries are based on other places, and Halt is from a different country called Hibernia, and they have to go back to Hibernia for something in this book, and it like just gets thrown into the past where we learn Halt's origin because he's a very mysterious man and we don't know a ton about him. And there's hints about it earlier in books. Like, Halt does say things that other characters don't really like clock, and then it all comes back to the story in this book and they're like, oh my god, wait, you did mention that once and I thought you were joking. So I really, really enjoyed this book. It also gives some character tropes that I love and some character tropes that I hate. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but overall I do really like the direction that this book takes the series. And then, as I said, this book really is a bunch of duologies, and the one that goes with The Kings of Clonmel is Halt's Peril, Book 9. This book stressed me out so bad. The tension in this is so well done, and I would put this as my third favorite book in the series, but it's very close ranking. It's not like one is miles ahead of the others. It's a close ranking, but this one I would put at number 3. It's called Halt's Peril, so you know that some bad stuff happens to Halt, and I was on edge reading this book, even though I knew how this ended. I've read this book 5, 6, 7, 8 times already. I knew everything turned out fine. Spoiler alert, but everything turns out fine. But still, reading the stuff that happens in this book, I was my heart was beating fast. I was starting to sweat. This is the greatest book in the series in terms of actually fearing for the characters, I think. And it's just so good. Then we have book 10, which is The Emperor of Nihanja, which, if you can't tell from the title and the cover, this is Japanese inspired, so we follow some characters as they go to Nihanja, which is fantasy Japan, and it's not my favorite depiction of Asian inspired fantasy. It's kind of got the same issue as Eric's Ransom, where it's a white author writing fantasy inspired by cultures that aren't his own, and it's not necessarily outright racist, it's just a little bit meh. And this one definitely isn't as offensive, in my opinion, as a white person, so do with that what you will. It's not as offensive as the depictions of the Middle Eastern inspired races or characters, whatever the world. I don't know, man. I think this one is more just silly and kind of funny, but this is technically the last book in the series, but it's also not. So originally there are these 10 books, and then the 11th book is a collection of short stories, which we will talk about. But then there was another book written after that that was marketed as book 12, but it's got a time skip and it follows Will taking on his own apprentice. But then shortly after it was published, it was actually republished as the first book in its own sequel series, which then made this one the actual last book. And it just kind of fell flat in that aspect. If it wasn't the last book in the series, I feel like I would have liked it a lot more. But it kind of just feels like a greatest hits and doesn't really do anything. First of all, Will's horse, Tug, who has been a major character so far because ranger horses are extremely important to the Ranger Corps, Tug's not in this because they travel to the other side of the world, and it's just so sad that you don't get to see him in this final book. And then there's a bunch of characters who are there for not really any reason except they're popular characters from past books, and so they're kind of shoehorned in here to have a little bit of more page time, I guess. I don't know. It's a good book, it's a fun book, it's just not the best in my opinion. And finally, we come to the last book, the one that I actually just finished reading a couple of days ago at the time of filming this, and that is The Lost Stories. So, this book is set up kind of weird. So there's 9 stories, a fragment, and then there's an intro and an outro page, and the intro and outro set up this frame around it where we're in modern times, so what would be the equivalent of the 21st century but set in this world. And it's an archaeologist and his assistant at the ruins of the castle that Will grew up in because he was an orphan and he grew up as a ward of the state. And they're like at the ruins of this castle and they discover a chest full of stories, and he's like talking to his assistant. He's like, we thought all the stories of these mythical rangers ended when they went to Nihanja, but these are stories that take place after. And I'm like, this is too weird. I don't like that framing of it. It's wild and off, and I'm just not a fan. But then there's 9 stories in this, and most of them take place in like some semblance of chronology and like follow the same arc. And the arc is that Horace and another character, I don't want to spoil things, but they're getting married, and Will is going to be the best man, and so he's writing a speech and he's having trouble with it. And that's like the overarching plot, is setting up for this wedding. And most of the stories follow that. We have 1 or 2 stories about Gillen, who was Halt's apprentice before Will, and it's like following him doing stuff. And then we have 1 story that is actually the story of how Halt came to Araluen from Hibernia, and that's a good story. But if you take those out, this could have been like just an actual novel. It would have had to be like tightened up in places because these were written as short stories, but like the short stories we get that follow Will are just one arc. And I feel like it should have just been another novel, and it could have been a much more satisfying conclusion than The Emperor of Nihanja was. I don't know, other people might think differently, but that's how I feel about this. But I'm also not a huge fan of short story collections, so I don't know, I could be the outlier here. We also get a really sweet last short story in this with Will and another character, and I love it so much. But then I remember what John Flanagan did to that other character in the very beginning of the sequel series, and I hate him so much for what he did. I'm not gonna spoil anything because I want other people to read the series, but like, man, John Flanagan really dropped the ball on that character, and I know everyone who's read this hates what he did to that character. But we also have a fragment at the end of this that is like hinting at the companion series, because there's this series, there's a duology that follows Halt as a ranger, so it's called The Early Years. Then there's the sequel series, which is The Royal Ranger, and then there's the Brother Band Chronicles, which is a companion. It takes place in a different country and follows a boy who is half Scandian, half Araluen, so it's like the Viking fantasy series of this world. And I actually plan on reading those next year, the same way I did this, with 1 book a month. But there's like a little fragment at the end that like kind of pushes you like, hey, you should read these books next. So I thought that was very cute. But overall, I thought this was fine. I just wish it would have been like an actual book, because most of the short stories in here felt like they could have been part of an actual book. And so my journey with rereading this series this year comes to an end, and I'm so sad. I love this series, and it's so bittersweet finishing it every single time I do, because I want to stay in this world with these characters, but things have to come to an end at some point, and that's here for me. I'll pick up this series again in the future, I know that. I don't know when, probably not for a while, honestly. I'll give it a couple of years, but for now, I'm just sitting here thinking about the characters, and uh, I just love them so much. I just can't believe these characters, these books have been in my life for so long. I really hope that this video convinces some of you people out here watching it that you should give the series a try, even if you only pick up the first book or two. I think that's a great thing, because it's such a good series. It does have its downs, but it also has its ups, and I think those ups outweigh the downs by far. It's so good. So yeah, if you take anything away from this, just read this series, please. It'll make me happy. But that is all for me today. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a big thumbs up. You can subscribe to my channel for more content, and that way I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye, everyone!